Hello, is coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you're watching on, and we can communicate directly through the chat room here in the studio. And I hope that you're having a wonderful day. And today I'm going to be talking about my newest book. Pardon me for a moment. So as you know, my most recent book was the Corellian Book of the Dead. I beg your pardon, I have a bit of a cough this morning. It is winter here in central Illinois. I'm less than thrilled about that, but it comes with being in central Illinois. And the Corellian Book of the Dead deals with Corellian ideas about death and dying and reincarnation and working with the spirits. And hello to Jai Rajput in the chat room. The new book is Reverend Don's Book of Astrology. And it's just what it sounds like. It's a book about astrology. And we've talked about the idea here on the program before. And after some thought about different subjects for the next book, I decided to do this one because it's the one people had expressed the most interest in. And it's going to talk about basically how to create and interpret an astrological chart for yourself or for anyone else. The parts of the chart, how you interpret them, what they mean, how they go together. And you can use it for a natal chart or for any other chart that you would like. And I think it will be a very interesting subject. I intend to talk about the planets, the signs, the aspects that can occur between planets, and the houses, and probably a little bit about history. And we'll see what else ends up there. And I'm certainly interested in any questions that people might have that can be added to the book if there are other things people want to know about beyond these things. So if you have any questions on astrology, feel free to direct them towards me. As I say, this is a book about casting an astrological chart. It is not as much about applying things on a daily basis, although certainly if you can cast a chart, you can apply things on a daily basis. That's what you do for daily astrology. You consider the chart of the day versus your own natal chart, or the natal chart of a group or institution that you might be working with, or another person you might be working with, and you see how they line up together. You see what aspects are formed between the position of the planets in one chart versus another one. And that really is the most personal form of astrology. Astrology is something that has been used in many different ways over the centuries, some of them a little bit more reasonable than others, and some of them we get a little bit more out of than others. I mean, the most famous example of astrology is sun sign astrology. And a lot of people who practice astrology will say that you're not going to get a lot out of sun sign astrology. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. And Renee says, I'm excited about your new book. Thank you, Renee. And I should have it available at Corellian.com this afternoon. I mean Corellianpublishing.com this afternoon. And I think people will find it quite interesting. As I was saying, many people who practice astrology will say that you can't get a lot out of sun sign astrology. I would say that sun sign astrology can be helpful in some ways. I have relied on it on occasion and found it helpful, but then I am a believer in the idea that whatever form of divination you choose to work with, once you've chosen it, Spirit will use it to communicate with you. So I believe that sun sign astrology, although a very shallow form of astrology, can still be helpful, but then I also believe that fortune cookies can be helpful omens as well. Hello to Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Michael. And And Jai Rajput asks, is astrology really guessed the future? Um, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. Astrology is sometimes used, well, astrology is used in several ways. It's used for character analysis. It can be used for future prediction. Um, and when it's used for future prediction, it's based on the idea that what has happened when certain aspects came into play before is likely to happen when they come into play again. Um, I don't personally see a lot of people using astrology these days for future predictions. It's much more um, for aligning with the energies of the present, but it certainly can be used for future predictions. Um, and that would come under the heading of orrery astrology, as I recall. And Nostradamus famously used orrery astrology for many of his predictions, or so it is said. He was notably an astrologer, as well as a medical doctor. And with orrery astrology, what you do is you look at future dates and you interpret from the chart of that day um, versus the natal chart of a person, a country, an organization, or just in its own right to see what is likely to happen at that time, again, based on what those aspects led to in the past. Um, Astrology works largely through the position and aspects of the planets in the signs and the houses. And I am a great believer in the idea that astrology really works through mathematics. Um, I don't see any way that astrology can work through the influence of the actual position of the stars and planets because the astrology we generally use is not especially connected to them at this point. It's connected to where they were 2,000 years ago. And that is not where they are today. Of course, there are multiple forms of astrology. We have both sidereal and tropical astrology, which could be its own show. But the general form of astrology does not use the actual position of the planets. It uses the mathematical repetition of the patterns. And so if you ask me, astrology works through the mathematical repetition of cycles in time that have been marked by the position that stars and planets once held, um, but which are actually repeating on their own in a mathematical fashion. And hello to Jason in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jason. Um, and that what it really is a way of interpreting the patterns of time. Um, and the stars are all well and good, but they're merely the markers. And hello to Joanne in the chat room. And Joanne says, many moons ago, I had a kit with charts, etc. Now only the book. Numerology also, as well as dreams. It's old, but I still have it. Um, and and there and that sounds like a very interesting kit. Astrology can be a very fascinating thing to work with, and it can be very precise. I've talked a few times about things that really caught my attention. No, you can really see the gray streak today, um, squirrel. But when I was young and studying astrology, one of them was talking about how how powerful my voice was. And at the age that I was reading this and studying this, my voice was not. That came later. And looking back, I'm quite my attention is quite gotten by that. Um, and Joanne says, "Nice tie, thank you, Joanne." And Jai says, "Can the energy of planets and stars affect the birth process of a child?" Um, I think I would refer to my former statement that it seems to me that The way that things like astrology work are through the mathematical repetition of patterns and really don't have much to do with the position of planets and stars, at least where they are now, except as markers for those mathematical patterns. Um, so I don't think I would see it that way. I'm not going to say no, because it all depends on how you approach it. And as I say, there are multiple forms of astrology. But rather, I would look for those mathematical processes. And again, I associate them with planets and stars only as the markers that we use to measure them. Um, Astrology began in the ancient Near East, as far as we know, in the area that we might call, I think it was already the Babylonian culture at the time that astrology has its earliest um, record. And this was an area where it was especially easy to see the stars. And it took a while to develop its modern form, but it certainly did so in antiquity. Um, and you find astrology moving from Babylon throughout the Near East into Egypt, later into Greece and Rome, and then into Europe and other places. You also see astrology develop in India. The Druids supposedly practiced astrology, but the kind of astrology you see in India is not the same as Near Eastern astrology, and I would not assume, I think it would be a foolish assumption to think that the kind of astrology the Druids were practicing was the same as Mediterranean astrology. We see astrology being very prominent among the Mayans, and again, very different. Probably the most interesting astrological theory I have seen has to do with the caves of Lascaux. And if you're familiar with the caves of Lascaux, they are prehistoric caves that are known for their animal paintings. And if you've seen cave paintings of animals, chances are you've seen the paintings from Lascaux, although they certainly aren't alone. But they're among the most frequently referenced. And they also involve little black dots that have been wondered about for a long time, but there's been a suggestion made that they're actually astrological notations and that some of these animals represent not earthly animals, but constellations. And if that's so, it would make it a very ancient form of astrology and quite fascinating to think about. Joanne says the Chinese astrology is cool too, and that's true. China, Asia has a fascinating astrology system that involves 12 year signs um, and is divided into heavenly stems and earthly branches, um, I believe. And Chinese or Asian astrology is very fascinating to study. And in the second degree lessons that I wrote 20 years ago, we talk about it at some detail. Um, and The particular astrology I will be talking about in this book will be Mediterranean astrology. But a book on Asian astrology might come in the future. It is certainly a fascinating subject. Again, pre-Columbian American astrology is a fascinating subject. And that idea of an ancient European astrology is a fascinating subject. And one of the things it speaks to is that humans tend to do the same things at different times and in different places. Um, Using the stars as a system of omens seems to be kind of a natural thing that we do. And just like building pyramids is a natural thing that we do. And people often are quite struck by the prevalence of pyramids all over the world and in many different civilizations. And they often wonder why this is. Pardon me. Why so many cultures built pyramids? And of course, the answer is it's one of the easiest things to build. It's one of the first things you'll discover how to build if you start building. So it's natural it would be one of the first things to build. Um, it really requires no further explanation than that, in my opinion. But that's going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. But I'm going to go down a little farther. I've been seeing lately, again, memes about the presence of buckets in ancient artwork, um, images of divine or priestly figures carrying small buckets by the handle. And I just have to point out that a bucket, which is a container to carry things, is obviously one of the most common things you would ever expect to find in any civilization, and there should be no surprise that we do so. Um, it is not evidence of ancient astronauts. Hello to Eve in the chat room. Making a bucket, and it's worth saying that the images in these artworks might be buckets. They might be purses. They might be any number of things. Um, but the fact that they're there is not a great surprise, and it is certainly not an earth-shattering revelation. Now, there are some things that show up in different parts of the world that do really raise some interesting questions, and some of them have led to some interesting answers, and others are still out there. But the fact that there are pyramids all over the world really isn't one of them. Um, some of the other things that are interesting, that one of the things that I always had to take into account, it was pointed out somewhere that I was reading long ago, if there had been a great deal of contact between the Western and the Eastern hemispheres um, in the pre-Columbian era, you would expect to see the foods that are unique to each hemisphere having crossed over at some point during that. And for the most part, you don't. There are, however, some interesting questions about that. One of them is that I believe that maize or corn was growing in Africa before there's any explanation of how it got there. There are ways it could have gotten there that don't raise any questions, but there's no particular evidence of it having done so. And that is an interesting question. And hello to Jan in the chat room. However, it's only a question because there are perfectly ordinary ways that could have happened. I see a lot of posts from people who are trying to draw conclusions that don't follow, um, who simply don't seem to have a wide range of knowledge of existing history and existing historical knowledge, and therefore make conclusions that don't follow. But that's beside the point. Getting back to astrology, we were talking earlier about Mediterranean astrology, Asian astrology, pre-Columbian American astrology, Indian astrology, and possible European astrology. And the fact that we find astrology in all these places um, only suggests that it's natural for people to look for messages in the stars, to see them as a kind of omen. Every one of these astrologies has significant differences um, to the point of having, in some cases, very little, if anything, in common. They're fascinating systems in their own right. Um, and I think they all are very rewarding to study. And I have at different times studied all of them. And I find them all very fascinating. And in Asian astrology, I am a rabbit, and I'm very proud to be a rabbit. And therefore, you'll sometimes see me using rabbit imagery. My mother before me was a rabbit, if I remember correctly. Um, Sir Edward is a rabbit. Lots of rabbits running around in my life. Um, I tend to think of the rabbit as one of the Corellian heraldic animals, and I I find that very very interesting. When we look at astrology, there are really a lot of interesting things there. So at this point, I want to take a moment. I want to remind you of Travel Magic, which is available at CorellianPublishing.com, and the Book of the Dead, also available at CorellianPublishing.com, and lots of other things, including downloadable Ule Cards. And if you're interested in a downloadable Ule card, you can find three different choices there. If you want one of them, what you would do is you would download it, print it out of your printer, and then give it to the person of your choice. And these cards have artwork from the Santa Tarot that I did a couple of years ago, and they're very cheerful and Yule themed. I'm thinking of doing greeting cards for the entire year. I'm curious for whether people would find that interesting. Um, and for myself, I could not tell you the last time I actually sent someone a card, but I know that there are people who still love to do so. And so I've been thinking of doing that. So if anyone has any opinion on the subject of greeting cards, and Joanne gives us a thumbs up, um, that's one of the things you will probably soon see coming from CorellianPublishing.com. So these are some of the projects that have been on my plate. And the Rev Don's Book of Astrology has an ETA of the spring equinox. Could come sooner, but that's the expected time of arrival. And as I say, it will be available to pre-order, and I'm hoping that people will enjoy it. My next project is to create the cover for it, because I need a cover in order to list it. And it does seem a little interesting to do the cover before I've actually written the book, but that seems to be how things are now. But what will go into the book is already all determined and laid out. It just needs to be put in place. One of the reasons I've chosen this particular subject is that, again, I've already thought it out in its entirety, and it should go together quite easily. If there's anything that people would like to see included in it, I would be curious to know. And that's kind of where we're at. And what other interesting things can I turn to? What other books would people like to see? I'm curious of that. We've talked a little bit. People have indicated. People have indicated things like an interest in numerology for talking about here on the show. I don't know if a series of books on divination systems would be something people would like to see from me. I've already written in considerable detail a number of pieces in the lessons and other places on different forms of divination, but developing them further into books is also a possibility. My attitude toward books was always that I didn't really want to write anything if I didn't have something new and original to say about it. It's one of the reasons it took me a long time to finally actually write a book. It came when I realized that I had a lot of original things to say, a lot of things that you would not find elsewhere. But I didn't want to just write another book that duplicated things that were already there. And I've tended to stay in that frame of mind. Um, and obviously, with something like a book on astrology, it's a well-established art. And so many parts of it will be things that you would find in any good book on astrology, but other parts I think are going to be original and different, and will be different from other books on astrology that you might read. So I'm hoping that it will be a book that people will quite enjoy. I'm looking at doing more. Oh, and Eve says, "You make things clear enough for all to understand." Thank you, Eve. I try very hard to do that. I often say that when I was writing the first degree lessons, Sir Edward stopped me and said, "You realize that the people who are going to be reading these do not have a background for some of the words that you're using," because I was using typical pagan words, pagan jargon that I had forgotten that non-pagan people would not recognize. This was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. I went back and I looked at what I'd written from the point of view of someone who would not recognize some of these words, um, and made it a point to explain them and to avoid unnecessarily um, unnecessarily technical terms, because the whole idea is for the reader to understand the subject. And with astrology, that can also be kind of an important thing. Um, in astrology, as in any form of metaphysics, there are lots of terms that have very specific meanings that if you have not studied it, you won't recognize. And I want to make sure that these are all clearly explained before they're used. That the way that we place and interpret things is clearly explained. Because, I've talked about how certain older metaphysical books often speak in arcane ways um, that can be hard to understand. And that this was intentional because they felt they were, I don't know, protecting the ideas from people they thought were unworthy of them. But what it's mostly done is cause those books to be forgotten. Um, I am not a believer in the idea of, not particularly a believer in the idea of secrecy at all. Certainly not with things like astrology. And I believe that the clearer and more understandable we are, the better off we're going to be, the better the reaction will be. So, yeah, I try very hard to make things clear for everyone. Um, and I think that if I were to say anything about my writing, and I want to thank Eve for bringing that up, but I think that would be one of the things that I would mention about my writing that I'm most pleased with, most proud of, trying to be accessible with it. And when I started writing, and I've written since I was a child in one way or another. I'm not talking about professional writing, but writing. I was much bigger on using the big $64 words, um, but I've tried to calm it down over the years and make it a little bit more accessible to people because um, it's not the point to to use the big words. It's the point to get the message across. And now, mind you, I still dislike computerized grammar um, checkers because they have such a limited background in education that they hate the way I phrase things. I do tend to phrase things from a rather broad and literate background. And the last thing on earth I tend to be concerned with is the idea of brevity. I tend to like modifying words, and that has to do with my generation and generations before it. I think that it's part of the nicety of language. It's part of the beauty of language. And I'm not a believer in giving up the beauty of language for conciseness. Um, I figure that we are better to preserve the poetry of our language as well as its usefulness. But that's my point of view. We'll see what the future holds. And Eve says, these are very well written books. I've done book 1, book 2, and I'm almost done with the 3rd degree. Thank you, Eve. Um, I worked very hard on all of them. And for a long time, I had to ask myself, what else can I write about? I put everything here. Um, but I didn't, in fact, put everything there. There are many more things for me to write about, and now I'm starting to write more about them again. And but if you go through the different degree books, you'll find an awful lot of information because I did my best to put in everything that that I could think of that was relevant. And Jason says, and he's still working on them. And yeah, that's true. I think I'll never be free of them, but that's okay because times keep changing, and there always need to be updates. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I'll be back tomorrow when we will talk more. I want to say that I love you all. I'm glad to spend this time of day with you. And I hope that you have a lovely afternoon. And let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we pray that we shall go forward together, hand in hand, for many years to come. We ask you to help us to make sense of our lives using all of the ways that exist for you to speak to us through omens and signs and dreams and everything else. Help us to maintain our connection to the divine at all times, and help us by guiding us as we go forward and by expressing yourself in the world through our efforts. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always, and I will see you tomorrow.